Okay, if we don't have any questions, we're going to proceed to the new book and to the new experience. A new experience in the sense that we're doing poetry this time around. We're doing a totally different, you know, set of ideas. So Candide was 18th century, right? And now we're talking about we're going to address the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. And this period is normally dominated by the Romantics. Who are the Romantics, and whether there is any, affiliation or any affinities between the Romantics as a school and perhaps romantic lovers, people who fall in love with each other. We need to start this way. When I say the Romantics, I don't mean people falling in love with each other. This entry that you may see in the dictionary is not what we have in mind. What we have in mind is a literary and a cultural and an intellectual movement that was dominant during the late 18th century and early 19th century, and it was because of this big movement that the literary and the cultural and even the political scene in England and in the rest of Europe will be the scene will be totally different. It's a radical movement. Radical. When I say radical, I mean those people don't settle with or for compromises. I mean, you either do the stuff the right way from the first time, or you don't do it. I mean, if they have issues with the government, they don't go and talk to the government, for example. They say no, and we're going to start a revolution against the government. See, if they have a problem with if they have a social issue, they don't handle it in the parliament or in a peaceful way. They would again advocate and promote ideas of rebellion, ideas of drastically changing the status quo. As you can see, they are very extreme in their reactions. Okay, they express that in their poetry, they express that in their arts, in the different genres that they have. So romantics can be poets. So you have romantic poets, you have romantic artists, you have romantic novelists. So it's a whole movement, like I said, and it has its people and its supporters and its promoters from the different from the different artistic and literary aspects. So they are not limited to poets. And they as we are going to see, because we're doing two romantic poets and one novelist or one short story writer. Okay, so again, we're stressing the fact that when we talk about the romantics, we don't talk about poetry alone. So of course poetry meant a lot and was dominating and everything, but we have romantic novels, we have romantic short stories, we have romantic paintings and romantic art. Okay, so we're the book that we're having, the new book is Romantics and Victorians, and this is book 2. So what is it that we're doing? We are A230A, which means that we're going to do the first part. It's called Romantics and Victorians, which means that we're going to do the Romantics. Okay, and when you go to A230B, inshallah, you will have the Victorians. So under the Romantics, what are we taking or addressing under the Romantics? We're addressing poetry in England, and novel or novel writing or short story writing in Germany. So it's both England and the continent. Okay, in England we will have poetry and poets, and in the continent we will have short story writing. So who are the writers or the poets that we're having? We're having William Wordsworth and Percy Bysshe Shelley, very famous poets, and I'm sure that perhaps the names ring bells at the back of your mind. You perhaps you may have done any of these poets. Again, William Wordsworth would be the first romantic poet that we're dealing with, and then we're going to have Shelley as the second romantic poet, English as well, and then we conclude this part about the romantics with Eta Hoffmann, the German short story writer, fantasy writer, as you're going to see. So fantasy is part of the romantic, as we are going to see and explain. Okay, so the first part of this book, significantly and aptly enough, it is called Romantic Lives. It will look at a selection of texts, both English and continental, from the Romantic period. So our focus would be on the Romantic period. Okay, so where? So we are talking about England and the continents. So who are the representations of England? We would have William Wordsworth and Shelley. And who is representing the continent? Who is the continental part to this equation? It would be Hoffmann, the German. This was, we're talking about the Romantic period, and we're saying that it was a literary period in which much writing displayed a new and growing interest in the inner imaginative life of the individual. So the focus is not on the outside, the focus is on the inside. Whatever is within the poet himself, whatever is within the author or the writer himself, as we're going to see. There is a great deal of conflation, there is a great deal of unity, which never happened before between the poet and the persona in the poem. Poetry or literature before the Romantics had its loyalties and its focus somewhere else. The focus would be on the outside, and this outside would be perhaps rules and regulations that you have to follow in order to pass off as a good poet or as a good artist. Perhaps looking back to the ancients, whether they are the Romans and Greeks, and getting your inspiration from them, and your originality would have to do with how imitative you are, which is very contradictory. You prove how original you are by going back to the Greek and the Roman models and by imitating them. So again, the focus would be on the outside. With the Romantics, you have a totally different approach to literature and to art. The approach is based on the of introspection, if you like. Is based on perhaps making some kind of unity between whatever is outside and whatever is inside. As you're going to see in poems by Wordsworth, he would go out in nature, he would have sweet sensations from seeing beautiful stuff, and then he goes back home and reflects on these things, and things nice poetry comes out of him. Okay, you never had that before the Romantics. Before the Romantics, like I said, a mark of your achievement would have to do with you being able to imitate and copy ancient Greek and Roman models. So that's why the poetry of the time was very artificial. You don't feel yourself in it. But with the Romantics, again, the reader is involved. The writer or the poet uh, indirectly says that I'm representing the reader in the poem. The feelings that I have, the feelings that I experience, also are also shared by the reader. Okay. So it was also the period when many still prominent ideas about what it means to be an author. Our association of writing with the gifted, inspired, and individual were first developed. So these ideas were first developed at that time. Never before was there a focus on the poet himself. The poet himself may be a mere medium, according to people before the Romantics. A medium or a platform through which ideas, old ideas, the ideas of the ancients, are being repeated. In this part, you will explore the portrayal of the life, nature, and function of the author in a selection of poetry by William Wordsworth and Shelley, and of course Eta Hoffmann's story, The Sandman, as you're going to see. Okay, is that clear so far? So, with the Romantics, you have again a different experience. So what are some of the characteristics of Romanticism and the Romantics? Again, the focus on the poet himself, whatever is inside the poet. Okay, the focus is on self-expression. Okay, on the focus on personal experiences. Before the Romantics, you have objectivity. Okay, you would have the writer, holding a mirror, reflecting and copying objective reality, and he doesn't interfere at all. And one of the pioneers of that approach was somebody that we know. Remember, we did him when we spoke about Candide. Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope was a very famous English poet, and he was a pioneer in the idea of holding a mirror to nature. You reflect what happens in nature, you copy classical models, and you never interfere. Okay, as a poet, you don't add from yourself, from your soul. No, the idea of soul and your idea of self, the idea of self-expressions never existed for them. Okay, so with the Romantics, the focus is on self-expression, is on the interior of the poet, on consciousness and memory. These are words that you're going to hear a lot when we talk about the Romantics. What else about the Romantics? The Romantics are turning the rules, um, the classical rules, on their heads. When they write poetry, they don't follow the rules of the poets before them. They invent their own rules. Okay, they are radical, and like I said, the word radical means that they, if they change how they write poetry, they change it altogether. They don't have compromises. Okay, so neoclassical poetry is all about decorum, is all about imitating ancient models. No, we're not doing that anymore. We're focusing on ourselves, on our own resources. Why would I, and this is one of the Romantic poets saying, for example, why would I go thousands of years to get inspiration when life is full of inspiration? My modern life, the life that I live now, has enough fuel and enough inspiration in terms of issues and in terms of even styles of writing. With the Romantics, the focus also is, yes, with the Romantics, the focus also would be on flesh and blood human beings, ordinary people. For as you'll see Wordsworth, for example, talking about ordinary individuals, people that you can meet, people that you can identify with. You're not talking about gods and demigods. You're not talking about ladies in courts, in royal courts. No, we don't have this grand style that remember Othello. Remember Othello when he used to speak in poetry and use very lofty kind of language, right? To the extent that Wilson Knight would say that this is music, right? Remember these things. We don't have that anymore. With the Romantics, we come down to earth. We are dealing with normal human beings, ordinary human beings, to the extent that Wordsworth would focus on the farmers in the fields. He would focus on the people of the countryside, and he would say that these people are the most honest, these people are very innocent, and this is human nature at its best. For him, the ordinary human being of the countryside are all in all, and they should be foregrounded, and the focus should be on them rather than on upper middle class and high classes and nobles and kings and queens and all these kinds of things. What else about them? We said that for them, ordinary people are the stuff that ordinary people and their concerns and their issues should be the stuff or the material that they would use in their poetry. And what is it that they depict? They depict the countryside for the most part, especially with Wordsworth. As you're going to see, he's going to leave the city behind altogether and go and live in the countryside in order to be close to nature, like he says. He says, nature, with the capital N, has an edifying effect on human beings. Nature is a teacher. And if you want to learn, and if you want to learn the right way, you go and live close to nature in the countryside. And as you will see, his poetry is all about just that. The characters are simple human beings. The scenery and the backgrounds are all natural and nature related. With the romantics, you're going to have a great deal that would link them to Gothic literature. Remember we spoke about when we didn't do that. No, this is different. Gothic literature is that literature that focuses also on whatever is occult, whatever is weird, whatever is magical. Okay, you normally talk about very strange places, um, to the extent that at one point the romantic would be conflated and would be equated with whatever is weird and whatever is strange and whatever is magical. What else about the romantics? Again, their political involvement, the fact that they are politically, the romantics are normally, except for a number of them, they are politically committed. Politically committed means that uh, um, they normally they are never in good terms with the government, with the politicians of their time. They always find uh, you know, errors and find faults with them, and they use their poetry in order to expose those politicians and those government figures. That's why they are uh, always under the radar of governments. They are always you know, under the tight grip and the tight control of the government. Sometimes they even have to flee their countries and go live somewhere else, or else they would be caught and thrown into prison. We're going to see that especially with Shelley. Okay, so these are ideas that we're going to experience and find and detect in the poems that we're going to deal with, romantic as they are. So William Wordsworth is the guy tonight, and then, like I said, Shelley, and then perhaps next time or the time after we will have Eta Hoffmann, the German romantic writer. When you look also at the title of the titles of the different parts, they can give you a great deal of insight into the poet that we are in for. When I say, for example, William Wordsworth, poet in a landscape. So two things. We're going to talk about a poet, and the focus seems to be on the poet. Again, we're talking about the inner recesses of human nature. We're talking about self-expression. We're talking about poetry that comes from within, not from without. Or at least there is some kind of union between whatever is within and whatever is without, or whatever is outside. So this is the poet part in the title, and then you have landscape, and by landscape, of course, we mean nature. Wordsworth is a poet of nature. Nature, and by nature, I don't mean the gardens. I mean the jungle. Okay, I mean the jungle, and I mean outside nature. Pure nature, the nature that does not have the interference of human beings. Okay, and then when we move from the chapter on William, or the part on William Wordsworth, we move to Shelley, and with Shelley, the second part of the title is Inner and Outer Lives. We'll stop on this note. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we can always continue, inshallah. Okay? I'll see you in 5 minutes, inshallah. Bismillah. Hello? Can you hear me? I'm back. Are you? Okay, good. So what is it that we were talking about before the break, the prayers break? Let me just put the glasses on. So we started a new chapter, and we're talking about the romantics, and we spoke about the romantics and I mean the associations of the word romantics and what it means, and we said that it's a school. It's a radical school of thought, and it's not exclusive to poetry. We have romantics as novelists, we have romantics as short story writers, and as artists. So what are we doing? We're doing three representatives of the romantics: two poets from England, and one short story writer from Germany. Okay, spoke about the different elements and the different characteristics of the romantic movement, and we said that there is um, a focus on the inner recesses of human nature. There is a focus on self-expression when it comes to the poet. There is a radical shift away from the old or the old poetic methods when it comes to writing poetry. There is no going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans for inspiration. No, the focus is on contemporary concerns and contemporary issues and problems. They have this glorification of outside nature, and their nature is pure nature. Pure nature, they have the example of the jungle rather than the garden in mind. There is a great deal that would link them to Gothic literature, to whatever is magical, whatever is weird. They are also radical in their political views, and they are always at loggerheads with the governments. That's why you see them fleeing their countries and living on the continent. In the case of Shelley, in the case of Lord Byron, and others, as we're going to see. Um, Again, three people were doing. We're doing Wordsworth, the English. We're doing Shelley, the English, and we're doing uh, Hoffmann, the German. We're going to check their profiles because I need to highlight stuff that we're going to take advantage of and use when we talk about every and each one of them. So this is William Wordsworth, for example. When you go to the right side, you see um, information and details about him. Uh, you get, for example, to know that he lived uh, he was born in 1770, which means the um, the end of the 18th century, and he died in 1850, in the middle of the 19th century. Enough time to have him, you know, moving from one side to another He started off very radical and he ended up very um, he ended up being loyal to the government, very regressive in his views. He was very progressive at one point, but over time he's going to change his views, which was not to the liking of so many people and so many supporters. Um, Again, we're going to look at how he got educated, uh, because we're going to compare him to Shelley, for example, when it comes to education. I mean, obviously, the two of them are, college educated. Uh, but whether their education is reflected in their work, this is very clear in Shelley. For example, we're going to see how he makes reference to Greek mythology and Greek learning, which is an indication that he benefited a great deal from the kind of schooling that he got at Oxford. Here, as you can see, uh, um, Wordsworth has his focus on nature, and his language is simple, unlike the language of Shelley, as you're going to see in a minute. Okay, but this is what I wanted to talk about when it comes to William Wordsworth. And William Wordsworth is referred to, along with Coleridge, as first generation romantics. Because when we come to Shelley and Keats and Lord Byron, we're going to refer to them as second generation romantics. Okay? So why would I refer to them as first or second generation romantics? Because it is true that the broad ideals and ideas are the same, but there are differences, and those differences have to do with the change of generation. The climate of ideas would change from the first generation to the second generation, and with this climate of ideas changing, you also have a change of perhaps attitudes, change of style, change of views, as you're going to see. I'm not going to talk much about him. Like I said, he is a first generation romantic poet, and he has his focus on self-expression when it comes to the poet, and on outside nature when it comes to material and stuff. Okay, let's move to the second one that we're having, and the second one that we're having is Percy Bysshe Shelley. And like I said, Shelley is also romantic, is also English, but he is a second generation romantic poet. And when I say second generation romantic poet, I'm talking about different concerns perhaps. Again, the broad lines would be the same. They are all romantics, but they are romantics in their own unique ways. Obviously, Percy's understanding of romanticism would divert from that of first generation romantics like Wordsworth and Coleridge. Okay, so as you can see, he is way younger than Wordsworth. He was born in 1792, and he died in 1822. And as you can see, he has such a short life. He didn't live long. In spite of the fact that he didn't live long, he was very influential. Perhaps people came to realize how important he is after he died. During his lifetime he had issues with the government. He has to flee the country and go live in Italy, and even he died in Italy. He people he came to his own. People recognized how talented he is after he died. Okay. Again, I wanted to talk about, uh, as you can see, look at his education, University of Oxford. Again, I was trying to stress the fact that this Oxford training that he received made it possible for him to to have depth and to have when it comes to writing poetry. He doesn't write about ordinary people like Wordsworth do or does. His language is not easy and accessible as that of Wordsworth. His language is rooted in what we now call intertextuality. Intertextuality means that you have allusions and you have references to other literatures, whether European or otherwise. He would go all the way back to perhaps Greek models, not to imitate but to mention and enhance the experience by establishing affinities between the affinities between what is happening and perhaps what is used to happen in ancient times. So again, his language is not as a second generation romantic poet. He has his own unique way of expressing romanticism. Again, his themes are complicated. His themes are, for the most part, mythological. He would depend on classical mythology a great deal. He is radical, and he remains and stays radical until he dies, unlike Wordsworth. Wordsworth started off very radical, but he ended up appeasing the government, if you like. Talking nice about them and perhaps acknowledging that he was mistaken in supporting the French Revolution, stuff like that. With Shelley, it's a totally different story. He remains, faithful to his ideas and ideals till the end. Again, he would write poetry where the focus is on the poet and what means to be a poet, and what it feels also to be a poet, and self-expression, and the vocation and the mission of poetry. He would refer to the poet as or poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. For example, he would show us that poets are not just another bunch of people. I mean, they are different. They are as important and as sacred as prophets. He would refer to the idea of the poet prophet, the fact that the poet is like a prophet. He has a message and he tries to get it across, a noble message, and he's trying to get it across to people through his poetry. Um, Again, he was radical in his views, and that would kind of land him in trouble with the government, and like I told you, that he would have issues and problems with the government. The third romantic figure that we have would be not a poet, but a short story writer by the name of Eta Hoffmann. So with Eta Hoffmann, we're moving from poetry to novel and short story writing. With Eta Hoffmann, we're moving from England to the continent. He is German. Okay, so again, we're trying to look at romanticism from different, perspectives. The perspective of poetry, and here we're looking at it from the perspective of novel and short story writing. So what is it that we need to know about E.T.A. Hoffmann until we talk fully about him? You would need to know that he was born in 1776. He's more or less, you know, contemporary to Wordsworth. He was born in Germany when it was called Prussia. It wasn't called Germany, it was called Prussia, and Prussia was, a union of a number of German regions. And he died in 1822. What else about him? And the genre that he is known for would be fantasy. So there is going to be a great deal of fantasy. Fantasy means whatever is weird, whatever is unfamiliar, whatever is uncanny, as we're going to see when we deal with him. Okay, so let's go all the way to Wordsworth. Okay, so what are the things that we're going to deal with, the poems that we're going to handle with Wordsworth? With Wordsworth, you're going to have the Daffodils. I'm sure you're familiar with the Daffodils. A point rash judgment, the brothers, and home at Grasmere. So these are the four poems that we're going to deal. I mean, of course, they differ in length, but they pretty much express the same experience, as we're going to see. The backgrounds are going to all be nature and outside nature, the nature of the countryside. Okay, with Shelley, we'll have To a Skylark, Ode to the West Wind, England, in 1819, and The Mask of Anarchy. And we're going to also do To the Lord Chancellor, Ozymandias, written on hearing the news of the death of Napoleon. So these are the poems that we're going to handle with the two romantic poets that we have. With A.T. Hoffmann, like I said, we're going to have a tale or a short story by that has the title The Sandman. The Sandman. And that would be the end of the course, inshallah. Okay, so let me ask you this question about Wordsworth. Have you done any poems by Wordsworth? Have you done Wordsworth at school? I mean, you can be when you were a student, and you can also be a teacher, and you may have done him as a teacher. Okay, so Amira hasn't, which is fine. Okay, fine. The reason why I'm asking about whether you have poetry experience or not, the reason why I'm asking is that if not, if you don't have a sense as what poetry is, so we need to start with perhaps defining what poetry is and how different poetry is from the other genres, right? So what makes poetry different from other genres? Is it the ideas? I'm asking, is it the ideas that distinguish poetry from other non-poetry genres? No, it's not the ideas, right? Because the ideas can be expressed and communicated in any genre. You can talk about love in poetry, and you can also talk about love in novels. You can talk about nature in poetry, and you can also talk about nature in novels and short stories, right? So it's not the themes and the ideas that make the distinction between poetry and non-poetry, right? It is the style, it is the structure, it is the form of the poem. So the form is what distinguishes poetry from non-poetry. And by form, I mean the formal aspects of a poem. Like in poetry, for example, you don't have this margin to margin lines. No, the lines are short, way shorter, right? In non-poetry, you would have paragraphs. In novels and short story, you have paragraphs, right? In poetry, you have stanzas, right? In in poetry, um, the musical effect on your ear is very important. One mark of a successful poem would be whether it has this musical effect on your ears or not. There is a great deal of music that is part and parcel of the poetic experience. If you don't get that musical effect, it means that the poet is not doing a good job, right? So how is this accomplished and how is that achieved in a poem? Through the rhythm and the rhyme and the internal music of the poem. You don't have that in drama, in novels. You don't. I mean, the focus obviously is not on music, and we don't have music. You don't have the lines are not musical unless you have a verse drama or something, right? But this is not what you're looking for in a play or in a novel. But this is what you're looking for in a poem. Music. Music and internal music. If you don't have music, if you don't feel and hear the music in a poem, it means that the poet is not doing a good job. Okay? Uh, with poetry, the different elements of a poem, I mean the music, the rhyme scheme, the imagery, the figures of speech, all contribute towards generating the meaning that the poet has in mind. Okay? So it's again not about the message, or it's not primarily about the meaning as much as it is about checking how the different elements of a poem can carry and deliver and get the meaning across to you. Okay, this is how we measure, this is how we judge the poet. This is how we measure uh, uh, the merit of a poet. You look at the internal and intrinsic values of a poem. Okay, so obviously reading a poem is totally different from reading an article in a newspaper, for example, or reading a novel or a short story, right? You have to stop at every single word. Poetry is about intensification of everything. Whatever other people say in whole novels, and some of these novels are 3 volume and hundreds of pages long. Whatever those people say in hundreds of pages, the poet is given a number of lines to express the same thing. Okay, so there are limitations obviously on the poet. He or she, of course, he or she cannot take his or her sweet time. No, he is limited in time and space. Hence the challenge. Hence the fact that poetry is not for everyone. You can be an excellent novelist or short story writer, but a poor, untalented poet, right? Again, when you approach a poem, your point of departure, your starting part, your starting point has to always be the formal aspects of the poem, not the message. Okay, so first thing you're supposed to do would be to break the poem down to its basic components in terms of rhyme, rhythm, imagery, music, um, figures of speech, right? And then you make the transition to the meaning. Okay, so you start off formally assessing and checking the formal aspects of the poem, and then after that you go to the biographical elements of the poem. What are the biographical elements? You would perhaps read about the age in which the poem was written. You would perhaps engage in a bit of search about the poet and his biography. Okay, but your starting point would be the text, the poem itself. Okay, you focus on what we call the literariness of the poem. Literariness means what makes the poem a poem. Obviously, and like I always say, it's not the theme or the ideas that makes the difference. What makes the difference would be the formal aspects of the poem. Is that clear? So, two approaches that we're having, but our priorities would be with the formal aspects. So you approach the poem formally and then you approach it thematically. You start off formally by addressing the formal aspects, and then you approach the poem thematically. You later on think about the ideas and the themes that the poet is trying to get across to us. And again, those themes and ideas are better expressed if the formal aspects of the poem are better utilized and better used. Okay. So now we're going to go to the first poem, which is the Daffodils. I'm sure it's a very famous poem. I don't know whether you have done it at any point in time or not. So this is the poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Are you familiar with this poem? I wandered lonely as a cloud. Have you ever wandered lonely as a cloud? And how does it feel wandering lonely as a cloud? I'm not kidding, I'm asking you. I mean, okay, that's interesting. Amira is saying yes. We all have been there, wandering lonely as clouds. And what are the sensations, positive or negative? You wander lonely as a cloud. Uh, Amira saying it feels like as if you are floating or in so much thoughts. That's interesting. Okay. Totally positive. Abir is saying totally positive. That's interesting. Okay. So you don't wander in cities, in towns with their hustle and bustle, right? You don't wander lonely as a cloud in Riyadh or Dammam or Jeddah with these are noisy cities, right? What do you need in order to wander lonely as a cloud? Where can you wander lonely as in a quiet town? Abir is saying in nature. Yes, excellent. In outside nature, which is normally in the countryside, in a dira. Are you familiar with the dira? When somebody says, "I'll have my perhaps my weekend with my family in Al Dira." Yeah, this is exactly what Wordsworth has in mind. It's a place where there is a great deal of greenery, right? Quiet. It's peaceful and quiet, right? Lots of perhaps animals because animals also give you this sense of naturalness, right? Okay, so it is as if Wordsworth is saying that as, and I'm adding this, as I was wandering lonely as a cloud, something happened. Are you getting the idea? So let's focus on the idea. Yes, that's correct, ya Marwa. No cares, no cares, and no cars, no pollution. That's correct. Okay, fine. So look at the idea of alone, because alone is also uh, yeah, loneliness is something that the romantics يعني something that they care about. And cloud is also an element of nature, right? So you wander lonely as a cloud in nature, and being a cloud is also part of nature. So as you can see, even the title promises you big things, promises you perhaps sweet sensations, because as I was wandering lonely as a cloud, something happened. So it promises you sweet sensations, right? And it also sets the tone of the whole atmosphere right from the very beginning. It's nature that we're talking about. It's nature that we are having in the background, right? Okay, so let's move on. So I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high, that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. MashaAllah. Great. It's a whole scenario, right? It's as if you are looking at a painting, right? When you excellent, excellent, Abir. This is what I wanted to say. So vivid. When you have this, feeling that you are, as if you're reading a poem or part of a poem, but you have the feeling that you are looking at a painting. This is a good or a bad feeling. This is success or failure on the part of the poet. Okay, good. So I wandered lonely as a cloud. Okay. So it was me that was wandering lonely as a cloud that floats. I was floating, right? On, I was floating on high vales, and these are elements of nature, right? Vales means valleys, and hills, and these are things that are limited and are unique to nature, right? When all at once, see the drama in it. I saw a crowd, and when he say, or when he says I saw a crowd, you feel, yeah, at the start you may think that he talks about people, right? But the crowd that he has in mind is not. Remember, are you seeing this suspense that he is building? He could have said, when all at once I saw um, a host of daffodils, or a crowd of daffodils, right? Okay. Besides the lake, the lake is another element of nature. Beneath the trees, also another element would be the trees. Okay, and those daffodils are fluttering and dancing in the breeze. It's a very beautiful image, right? See? So it's not only him that is wandering and floating, it's also the daffodils. Okay? So can you see this unity between man, capital M, I mean man, man or woman, between man and nature? You see how they get together, how harmonious the whole thing is. Okay. So now that he has seen the daffodils and they're fluttering and dancing, the second the second stanza is going to be, more or less like a continuation of the scene, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. He's talking about himself or talking about the daffodils? So obviously the daffodils took over, right? So they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. See? He's completing the image that he has started in the first stanza, right? Very beautiful. It's all natural. It's all innocent. No talk about the city or the town with its hustle and bustle, right? The waves, okay, and they even have this um invigorating effect and influence on other elements of nature. We have the waves beside them danced. When they saw, I mean, when they see them, they interact dancing, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. But the daffodils were even more prominent and even more, um, you know, uh, perhaps quicker. A poet could not, but in a situation like this, where there is purity, there are elements of nature that are in complete harmony. So if we have a poet, he's saying, if we have a poet who happens to be a representative of human beings, what kind of feelings and sensations would he get? And the answer is clear. A poet could not but be gay, happy, glad, right? In such a jocund company. It's a company that we're having, okay? A company whose elements are human, a human being, the poet, right? The daffodils, the waves, right? See how beautiful the whole scenario is? Outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. Okay, he's going to be part of the image now. He's going to say, I gazed, I started to gaze at them, and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. He's, by the way, he's preparing us to something else. At the time, he had those very sweet sensations, but that was it. That's why he's saying, I gazed and gazed, but little thought. At the time, I didn't think much about what I have seen. Okay, it's a beautiful scene, and everything is in complete harmony. And this is where I left it. Okay. For oft when on my couch, I mean, see the change or the shift. For oft when on my couch I lie. Where is this couch? Is it in nature? Is he still there with them in outside nature? No, obviously no. He is at home on the couch. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, when I started to think about it, back home on my bed, they flash upon that inward eye. Inward eye means the imagination that I have. They just flashed. I remembered, which is the place of solitude. Okay? He says that those sensations, those recollections of beautiful imagery like these are only possible if you are in solitude. Solitude means that you are alone. And then my heart with pleasure fills. See the effect? When I recollected what happened and I started to picture the scene right from the very beginning, then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. It's very beautiful. I never read it the way I'm doing it now. It's so classic, so beautiful. Okay. Um, I would like you when you go home, you're already home. When we finish from here, I would like you to kind of give it some further thought. I would like you to read it one more time, and I would like you to read all the poems that we have in this collection. Remember, those of William Wordsworth and also Shelley. So you're having the Daffodils, Point Rash Judgment, the Brothers, Home at Grasmere. I mean, let's just focus on William Wordsworth. Okay, read the poems of Wordsworth. Okay, let's agree on that. We're not meeting tomorrow because tomorrow is too soon, right? We are meeting, inshallah, on Wednesday. But let's agree. I, it would be nice if we start at 4, yeah, instead of 6, right? So it's Wednesday at 4 p.m. inshallah. Again, until then, I would like you to read all the poems that we have for Wordsworth. Agreed? Okay. طيب. طيب, on this note and with this item, we come to the end of tonight's class. Until we meet again on Wednesday, I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum. Bye bye.